Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. In the 1970s, I was in college in central Illinois with no money and wanted to visit my parents living on the West Coast. As was common then, I decided to hitchhike. Before I left, a friend gave me a copy of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, a semi-autobiographical novel where a couple of young fellows take their restless energy and rebellion in search of America. Numerous books and films have covered this theme. Travel with Charlie, John Steinbeck, Thelma and Louise, with Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis. In our podcast today, we'll continue with this genre, discussing with Sarah Kendzior her new best-selling book, The Last American Road Trip, where a young family loads the kids in the car and hits the road to discover our country, past, present, and future. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We're here again with Sarah Kendzior. Glad to have you back on our podcast, Sarah.
Oh,
Are,
thanks for having me.
and you're back at home in St. Louis, is that correct?
Temporarily, yes.
Okay, because Sarah's in the middle of a huge book tour, which we'll talk about, and it's a torturous schedule. Greg, you're in Pittsburgh, and I'm
I
in,
am.
and you can tell by the
You're on
plaid
Route 66.
I'm in the Northwest, but thinking about Route 66. So, Sarah, you've written four books, and your
Mhm.
first book, Blue View from Flyover Country, 2015, was a look at was kind of the dispatches from the Midwest. And Greg and I are both from Central Illinois, and I love that book about how you were looking at the economic hardships that were occurring in the Midwest, and it really hit home with both of us. Your second book, View from Hiding in Plain Sight, was about the kind of the invention of Trump, and why
Mhm.
he's here, and he's been around and he's been a joke for a long time, but where did he come from, and the power of his rise. We had you on our podcast with your third book, which is They Knew How
Mhm.
Culture of Conspiracies Kept American Complacent. Um, and that was another book. Well done. And your book that we're talking about today, I really like this, Sarah. It's the
Thank you.
Last American Road Trip, and it's kind of I don't know, kind of a punk rock corn road trip book, memoir, right? Something like that.
Yes, that's
You
exactly right.
you load your husband and the kids in the car, and you take off and hit a whole bunch of states and parks, and then use that as a way of talking about what's going on in our country. Did I get that kind of right?
Yeah, yeah, over a period of 8 years from 2016 to 2024, on and off, but watching the country as it changes physically, politically, etc.
Right. And I before we get going too, I also have to mention I love your blog. I'm a subscriber to your blog, and
Thank you.
in fact, I also came to Seattle when you did your book tour, so I'm
Hmm.
almost to the point where you're going to have to get a restraining order against me.
That's okay. It's my
Oh,
pleasure.
okay. All right. That's good. Hey, how is the book tour going? Tell me about
It,
that.
It's good. I mean, the only thing, it's tiring, but I love visiting all these cities. Seattle, I hadn't spent a lot of time in before. It was nice to see that. Then I had to leave immediately for Portland. Convinced the publisher to let me have a car because it is a road trip book. Drove to Portland, so I finally got to see some Pacific Northwest coast and whatnot. Then we had to fly to San Francisco. Then I flew back to St. Louis. Then we drove down to Austin, stopped in Joplin overnight, drove up to Tulsa, drove back to St. Louis, and now I'm about to fly to Tempe and then to LA and then back down to Montgomery, Alabama. So yeah, it's a weird tour in the sense that the Northeast is apparently verboten for me, but it's nice to be able to see the rest of the country. And the
Um,
readers have been great. Everybody has been wonderful and welcoming, and I'm very, very grateful for all the support.
so Greg has been lives in Pittsburgh, but his older sister, who he takes care of, lives in Central Illinois. And you've been doing a lot of road trips, Greg, back and forth to Illinois and Pittsburgh. Did this This would have
Yeah,
been a good book for you to put on the audio when you were
yeah.
traveling, right?
Unfortunately, I'm traveling a road I know too well over and over again, so it's not so
Yeah.
much fun. But
So
anyway,
let's talk about this book. Tell me, where did this come from? You said it's written over a period of time. I guess you keep track of everything, right?
Hmm.
And you are looking at four trips, 98 and '07 recently, where you just throw the kids in the car and
And
hit the
took
road.
off. There are some mentions of trips I did long, long ago, like the one you just mentioned, 1998, which is the first time I ever did a road trip across multiple states, starting in Lubbock, Texas, and driving west when I was 19 years old. Most of it though is about parenting in this age. In 2016, because of a lot of things, political corruption and turmoil, climate change, threats to national parks and national landmarks and historic sites, and so on. I was very worried that my two kids, who at the time were 6 and 9, would basically not get to see the country that they were born into, that a lot of places would be destroyed as they got older, which unfortunately, now that this book is coming out, this appears to be coming to fruition, which is a really horrible thing to see. But basically, whenever we had a chance, spring break or summer breaks or whenever we had enough money, we would go see, a national park. We'd drive in every single direction. And we always drove because that's what Midwesterners do. It's a lot
Right.
cheaper to load the kids in the car, but also we're in Missouri, which is right in the center of the country. So when we would take a road trip, we would see everything. We would go in every direction. We'd see every kind of landscape, every kind of town and big city. And so my kids saw, 38 states and I think 21 national parks. And, we drove almost all of Route 66, a lot of different things. But it was such a tumultuous period. In the middle of this, of course, is COVID, where we were held in place for a while, in the beginning period of that. And so I just wrote about this time. Like I hadn't set out initially to write a book of 8-year travels, raising children until now they're basically young adults. Or my daughter is almost 18, my son is 14. So there's that aspect too. But in the end of my book, Hiding in Plain Sight, in the epilogue, I mentioned this. I mentioned how I was sort of rushing around the country out of fear of what was happening to it, trying to show my kids everything really fast before it disappears. And then that book, of course, was released in April 2020, right as there was COVID lockdown. So it felt like a good thing I did that. But there was such a strong reaction to that from readers and especially from parents that I wanted to sort of fill it out and make it a whole book. And I also somewhat had to get away from writing these very dark books about political corruption that I'd been writing. Although I will say, this one does have visits to the Mena, Arkansas, Iran-Contra drug smuggling airport. I took my kids to the hotel room in Chattanooga where Al Capone was apprehended. So in many ways, it's in the tradition of my previous books, but it does deviate somewhat in being a memoir, a travelogue, and so forth.
Hiding in Plain Sight was a book that you were making all of these, both explaining where we got Trump and where this is going to be going. And if you read it at the time, you would think that you were kind of a conspiracy nut. And as it turns out, it's worse than you said it was. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's as bad as I was allowed to legally print. The original version of Hiding in Plain Sight. And so much of that book, there's such an attempt by the original lawyer hired for that book to try to censor it. I mean, they wanted to pull the whole section about, Jeffrey Epstein. They wanted to pull stuff about Felix Sater. It's all in there. And a lot of the articles I used as resources. This is a very meticulously sourced book. It has a ton of endnotes because I was very careful. A lot of those articles are now gone. They're gone from the internet. Some are archived on Internet Archive. So this is a book that is completely accurate. It's largely a history book, like you said. It shows the history of Trump, his rise from the late 70s onward, in the failure of American institutions, which were either complicit or cowardly or complacent. But, it was a two-way street. It wasn't just Trump. He's not some kind of mastermind. He had a lot of help in this, and he has a lot of people using him as a kind of bulldozer to crush all the things that are good about the United States. But yeah, one thing that's really funny is that there's, I mean, in a horrible way, is that there's some folks who think Hiding in Plain Sight must be my new book. They've just discovered it, and they think this must be new because if all this information was out there, clearly people would act on it. Clearly officials would take this very seriously and act on it. And I'm like, no, that book is 5 years old. That's been around the whole time, all this information. And it was a bestseller. Like, it hit every bestseller list. It was a big hit. And no one did anything with this information, which is largely about organized crime and the infiltration of our government by organized crime, which is why I wrote the second book, which is a follow-up. They knew, because they knew about all of this and did nothing. And then now I'm just writing travelogues because I can't take it anymore. So
I want to bring Greg in, but before I do that, I want to say that have people compared you to Mark Twain? I mean, you're both from Missouri, right?
yeah, I've gotten that.
You don't
The
look
dark
like Mark
humor, the
Twain.
Missouri Connecticut thing. It's too big a
Okay.
compliment for me to accept. So
Because before you got on, Greg and I were kind of, going back with each other. If you look at Twain, he's talking about slavery, Reconstruction. You're talking about neoliberalism and, like you said, trouble getting on research, digital disinformation. So it's not it's not really Trump, is it? Or what do you think?
it's a network with Trump in it. Trump is a very masterful propagandist. He's a very good demagogue. He's someone who knows what he needs to know, and he learns nothing more, and he keeps his mouth shut, and he's been connected to organized crime for about 50 years. That's when he was first investigated by the DOJ. It was in 1973. So this is a very skilled operator. A lot of folks think, this is a very stupid man. He's not. He's smart in a particular way. He's not some geopolitical mastermind, but he is an intelligent person. He is surrounded by an army of plutocrats, lawyers, mafia operatives, dictators, Silicon Valley, accelerationists who want to burn the world down. He's basically surrounded with the worst people alive who have decided to unite against the public will. And so he is an extension of everything that is wrong with this country. And a lot of people make claims about him being a Russian asset. I'd say, yeah, that's true. It's different than being an agent, just someone who is advantageous to the Kremlin, acts out its will. He's also, I would say, an Israeli asset. Like he works for their initiatives as well. So do the people in his camp, like Jared Kushner. It's a very multifaceted, transnational alliance. The one thing they have in common, though, is just total disregard for the sanctity of human life or the Constitution or laws that protect innocent and vulnerable people. They don't care about any of that. They just want to mine the country for resources and strip it for parts.
Greg, what do you think?
Yeah,
Sarah right? Is
your
Sarah
account
right?
your account of exposing Trump and knowing on facts that were available to anyone and was ignored and he was created. It reminds me of a friend of mine who was a filmmaker. I've been seeing him for some time, but he did a video. He did a documentary called Julia. I think it was Giuliani Time. And this was many, many years ago. It didn't get any traction really. Well done. Documented his criminal background, all his associates. And I think he shares Roy Cohn with Mr. Trump.
Mm.
But he produces this, and this was well before 9/11. And of course, 9/11 comes, and Giuliani is a hero. He's America's hero. Oh my God, it goes on and on and on. And it takes almost a generation to find out again that he's a crap, he's shit. But I'm sure you don't draw a great deal of satisfaction from being right when, in fact, it takes a long time for people to recognize that. But I see Trump, too, as created by the media. I mean, New York Magazine and New Yorker would he'd be important to them, except for the fact that he was put in a television as a celebrity. And those were liberals that create those shows. I mean, that put those shows together. They knew what Trump was. I read an account recently that they would have to cut and cut and cut in order to put a credible story together about why you'd fire the guy, because what Trump said made no sense. So they made him into a credible person when he wasn't one at that time. But I think you make an important point by saying people make a big mistake if they think he's stupid.
Oh yeah. And
I
I
mean,
think
liberals do that. Oh, why is he so stupid? No, he's
Right,
not.
right. Yeah. Hmm.
And I'm glad you brought up Giuliani because I feel like there are all these figures from both the first term and from the decades prior to Trump in the same criminal circle, often tutored by Roy Cohn or linked to Roy Cohn, who were given media makeovers, turned into sort of heroes or tycoons or whatnot, that are responsible for this current era. And during Trump's first term, all eyes were on Giuliani because Giuliani was acting as his lawyer, but he never paid any price for what he did. Neither did the other people in that circle. Roger Stone, Manafort. I guess he did a brief jail stint, but most of them are just running around, continuing to wreak hell upon this country. And you have to ask, why? Because all of these crimes were crimes that they often confessed to them. Like they were not hard to solve. You kind of just needed a library card and like a tape recorder, and they would just come out and be like, "Yeah, I did that. I committed obstruction of justice. I'm plotting a coup." Steve Bannon and the rest. They were very open about this, but no consequences for a certain group of people, often based in New York and often with roots in Iran Contra or in, I think, like New York City real estate business and politics of the late 80s, early 90s. And some of those guys ended up in jail, like the Michael Milken, Ivan Bosky, folks. But Trump managed to elude that. And I think the reason why he was never punished by anyone for anything is a big untold story that I've like hinted at and tried to pry my way into, but even I haven't fully figured it out. There's some documents saying he was in an agreement with the US government to not pay taxes for 30 years. And in return, he was supposed to have 3 children, which he did. He was supposed to run for president, which he did. This is all in hiding in plain sight. And these documents were recovered by the Czech security services. And when the Czech Republic became an independent state, they were revealed. I think it's bizarre that they're just sitting out there, and like me and like about 2 other journalists have looked at them and delved into this, because the question of why does he continually escape accountability when he is so overt in his criminality is a big one, because it indicts our institutions more than it indicts Trump, to be honest, at this point.
Let me ask you a question. On this point, what does it mean when all the business people, highest level business people, the tech bros and all that, and the industrialists, rush to him at Mar-a-Lago after the election, many of which, like Jeff Bezos, were opponents of Trump before. But what does it say about our larger business community, our industrialists, that layer of elite society that really have no principles? I mean, is that what the conclusion we should draw when they all went to kiss his ring?
Well, yeah, and I mean, the conclusion I draw is just one of fear for American society, because at this point, surveillance technology and just technology in general is something that people are so much more dependent on than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I can't escape it. My book's out on Amazon. I've seen people attempt to leave positive reviews for it and they get, rejected from that. I didn't have that kind of problem 5 years ago. There are a lot of things that I don't enjoy participating in that cause me to have to use technology made by people who I am, not just opposed to, afraid of, afraid of my privacy being violated, afraid that they're going to block me from circulation. It's very easy to censor people nowadays. You don't need to flat out do it. You can just kind of shadow ban them and disappear them and hope that they'll go away. So I just think they have too much control. And if they're bowing down to Trump, I don't think they're not bowing down to Trump, the man. I think they're bowing down to Trump, the network. And that includes, other Silicon Valley corrupt individuals, other, autocrats, other corrupt plutocrats. It's a big alliance and they don't want to be a target of it. It's worth remembering that Jeff Bezos was threatened and blackmailed right around the time, I believe he was hacked and, Saudi Arabia was involved. And this was around the time that Jamal Khashoggi was killed. So he was frightened. And I remember thinking, my God, if they could frighten him with all his billions of dollars and all of his personal security, what does that mean for the average American? Now we kind of know they get shipped off to a gulag in El Salvador. But it's a scary thing. They obviously have something big on a lot of big people. But I also think that a lot of those big tycoons are corrupt in their own right and are volunteering for this because they see it as beneficial to themselves.
Your PhD was in anthropology,
Hmm.
and I got about a third of the way through it. I love reading
You read my
PhDs.
dissertation? Oh my God,
Did,
someone read my dissertation. That's funny.
yes. I read Freddie DeBoer's dissertation. He said he had the same reaction.
Man,
What?
you're a hero, man.
Anyway,
Nice
The
in
okay.
fourth
Spain.
person. I've met the fourth
Okay,
person read it.
when you retire and you get rid of your kids, you can do crap like that.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't know anything about that now. So anyway, but it's about the political effects of the digital media, the when authoritarian states. You talked about the fall of is not
Uzbekistan. The
Uzbekistan,
attempted fall of
the
Uzbekistan.
attempted fall,
Yeah.
and then looked at all of the digital. And this is like when people were still walking around with Blackberries. I mean, it was
It's when
this
they
isn't
were
where.
blogging. That was the main form of media that I was studying was blogs. Uzbek dissidents writing blogs, having freedom of speech for the first time in their lives. And what do they do with it? They tried to battle the government. They did not succeed. But I think it was a valiant struggle. I'm not criticizing them. I'm criticizing the
Right.
totalitarian government. So
And the thing that I like about you is that you're not a anti-Russia, you're just explaining what you're seeing with these what do you call it, the mafia state kleptocrats, which is it could be in the United States, could be in Russia, could be in Saudi Arabia, could be anywhere. And how effectively the larger state crushes these movements, and also how difficult it is to get the good information out. Is that a general summary of what you found?
yeah, I mean, it's getting harder and harder. And it's weird for me to look back at that dissertation because I was looking at, a group of Uzbek Muslim men scattered all over the world who were each trying to undocument a massacre that the state denied occurred, the Endojan massacre, which the 20th anniversary of which is approaching in May, and also form a united opposition to try to combat their authoritarian regime. But there was a lot of infighting. There was a lot of paranoia. There was a problem with anonymity. Everyone thought that the surveillance, secret services were spying on them. I'm now seeing those exact problems now in the US. And I started seeing them around 2014, especially this sense of, what is truth, what is a fact, the ways that lies travel so easily, the ways people can pile on each other and smear each other's reputations. I thought, my God, I'm seeing the exact same dynamics that I saw, which I thought were kind of a product of living under an authoritarian state, where of course, you don't trust the media, you don't trust the government, you can't trust your neighbors, they might turn you in, you never can trust anyone, and it takes a huge toll on you psychologically. Americans are now at that place. And the other thesis of that dissertation, which was not a popular thesis at the time, is that the internet is not an inherently democratizing force. It can be used in that way and be very positive. It can also be very negative, and it can spread lies and slander and be very useful to dictators. And that was my prediction. I didn't think that the dictators that it would be useful for would be right here in my country. I mostly thought it was just allow already established foreign dictators to continue to thrive and to battle their opponents. But what happened is a lot of the dynamics of Uzbekistan, Russia, Azerbaijan, etc., are replicated here. Not completely. This is still very much an American phenomenon, but man, 15 years later, like we're really in a similar place to a well-established dictatorship in terms of trust, civic life, etc.
Maybe it's because I'm so damn old, older than Pat even. But these things kind of ebb and flow, and I agree with you about social media, and I think it's a good point that it's not necessarily democratizing. But if you view democracy or our politics in general over a long period of time, like when I was a youngster, the big change, a similar big change, which corrupted our politics in a similar fashion and in a big way, was television. I'm old
Mm-hmm.
enough to remember how retail politics was done in my neighborhood, in my small town I grew up in. And our Ori Miller, our Democratic Party committee person, would come around, offer rides, offer a drink maybe to somebody to get them to go. But it gave my aunt, who raised me, a chance to say, well, listen, Ori, this blacktop road out here is really in bad shape. Can you do something about it? He didn't necessarily do anything about it, but at least you had a chance to be heard. But
Mhm.
television stopped all that. Television, even a bigger way than social media does, turned it around so that you would never see people. You saw a TV image. It was a manufactured image. It was a rehearsed image. And it became more and more so and more driven by money. So, I mean, that's not to diminish what's going on now. It's just to say that American politics has really been a long, long period of this kind of technical change that really undemocratizes our way of doing things.
Yeah,
And
I,
I
I
think it was.
agree because I remember the excitement in the late 90s. I mean, I was a teenager, but the fact that I could start a website like me as like a
Mhm.
teenager and be able to spread my voice around and not have to rely on television or print media and not have to like knock on the gatekeeper's door, I thought was just amazing. Like I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe I could talk to people from other countries and other states. Like that's why there was so much optimism initially because we thought, wow, like finally no one can stop us, no one can censor us. Because the way American censorship always worked was just limiting the scope of the narrative. They cover a controversial topic, but they have like Geraldo cover it or something. So you get these like, partial truths mixed in with absolute nonsense. They limit the scope of conversation topics. And then there was this big change where it did seem like it was headed in a positive direction, and there was a real challenge to that, where like anyone could kind of start a website, and fight back. And then, of course, the same story. They got bought up by corporate conglomerates. They developed algorithms that censor people without the people that are being censored even knowing that they're being censored. All of those things, and it's such a shame that we lost that. I do miss that age, like kind of the golden age of blogging and people kind of just getting to know each other. People feeling obligated to provide resources and back up their claims. You used to get kind of, railed over if you didn't do that, you get in a lot of trouble. Now you can just write a meme and put a graphic and anyone will buy it. It's really like the quality has downgraded, and I think people in power are very glad about that. They don't want smart people writing well-sourced things.
I have a question for both of you. I don't know if you know Sarah, but Greg is the works with Marxist Leninist Today publication. He's not the editor, but he's kind of, helps coordinate it. He does these long, long pieces. He probably writes as much as you do. And they're very good. I always link to the like I'm a big fan. But I've noticed, and I'll set this up too. In my career, I was director of research and evaluation. I'd be on the internet, always looking at things, always trying to find stuff. I'm pretty good at that. I've noticed I just can't find crap anymore. I mean, things are paywall, things are I I'm looking at a review. This is hilarious review. It was by guy Jeff something who was complaining that in this book you only had 7% of the overall text is footnotes when normally it's just 15%. Like
It's a memoir.
Jesus
The
Christ, it's a
footnotes are in my mind,
memoir. It's
man.
a family. Well, okay, but the point being it seems like we're in a situation where these, it's harder to get information. Things is scrubbed. I don't know, Greg, do you find that when you're doing your
Oh
research on
yeah,
your
yeah,
your
absolutely.
pieces?
The paywall thing in particular, because I get a Google news feed, and I see something I'm excited about. Oh, let me read that, and boom, paywall. And okay, forget about it. Like the Nation, I've read the Nation all my
Mm-hmm.
life. I don't subscribe anymore because it's too much Democratic Party. But they still send me out stuff, and as soon as I want to read something, it's behind a paywall. I've used my, it's teasing, it's commercialized. Oh yeah, you get 5 free shots and then boom, you got to pay. And so I'm more and more limited, particularly in I'd say middle media. I can still access the people like myself that aren't monetized, just want to get our ideas out there. But when it comes to the middle strata and the big guys, of course, too, you can't get anything.
I'll
Yeah,
share
I
my I'll share
I
my
think
Nation login with you, Greg. Don't worry about
No, I
that.
don't. It's not important to me. It really isn't.
No,
What do
I
you
think
think,
this
Sarah?
is
Have
one
you
of the
seen a
biggest
change?
problems. Yeah, massive change. I could have never written Hiding in Plain Sight or They Knew with the internet now. I mean, I literally couldn't because like a lot of those links are gone, but a lot of them are also paywalled. My own articles are paywalled. Sometimes I think, wow, I know there was a really good article about it. Who wrote it? And I'm like, wait, me. And then I'm trying to go find it, and I can't get in because it's paywalled. And I'm like, well, I'm not paying to read my old stuff, and I just try to find an old version on a Word document somewhere. But
Yes.
it's nuts. And what I don't understand is why these millionaires, not even just companies, but like people are like millionaires setting up Substacks. Why don't they make it free? Because I make mine free. It is a volunteer paid thing. So folks who like my work, they pay. And even though they could get it free, just sort of out of respect for the work that I'm doing, because they want to keep it going and they want those archives open because there's investigatory material there no one else is doing. And I've managed to stay afloat. I'm not like making a ton, but I'm doing all right. Like I'm, feeding a family of four. If I can do it as a one woman operation from Missouri, then all of these big shot millionaire folks who just left their cushy jobs at MSNBC or whatnot, they certainly could, but they want to paywall it. I think that it reminds me of academia, which was also doing this a long time ago, paywalling vital information, keeping it from the public, even when it was publicly funded, so that people just wouldn't really be able to know what was going on. And this was a really negative effect because we also lost local media at this time. We lost local newspapers. We really need to hear from a variety of people. And instead, it's more difficult than ever. And I know people need to make a living. I'm extremely sympathetic to that. But I think there are other ways than the paywall. I think there's, ways around it if you can.
Matt Taibbi mentioned something about trying to set up a institute or whatever that would screenshot all of these things so that they could be available. I tried to find the article before you came on. I couldn't find it, but I don't know. It's a problem. I notice it in myself. It's just amazing. So,
Yeah.
Well, the
hey, I want
danger
to
Big
is
loss.
the danger is you go to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is clearly, I mean, one way or the
scrubbed.
other. It depends on who goes there. It's going to be biased one way or the other. But I still go to it because I can get factual data. I know the difference between a fact and an opinion. Most people don't. It appears that most people don't understand the difference. But I can sieve out the facts from a Wikipedia article. But it's a shame that that's the only place you can really go where it's
Yeah.
true.
Well, and they have sources. I mean, that's what I use it for. It's not so much what's on Wikipedia, but they have a source link, many, many sources usually.
Yeah.
And so you can use those and get to those and find out their existence. And I think that's going to be a prime target for Trump administration censorship. It's one of the few places left standing from kind of the old internet, and it leads you to the old internet, and they don't want you on that. They want you in a little, walled nightmare garden, and that's it.
Right.
Well, back to
Um,
Trump. Back to Trump.
okay.
What's your we've looked back, let's look forward. What do you think is going to happen? You have a record of prognostication, which is a good one. Maybe
Cassandra. Call her
Yeah.
Cassandra.
we can
No,
we won't hold you to
call
it.
some Nostradamus. That's what I want because I
Oh,
can only predict organized crime. I'm so sick of the consumption thing. But I see more organized crime in our future, more transnational organized crime. I'm very afraid of what's coming because we've now kind of met up with a lot of my worst predictions. They've manifested and they're moving at a very, very rapid speed. We're
mhm.
watching the economy collapse, which Trump promised on television in 2014 that he was going to do. He openly said this on Fox News, which I'm like, again, this was all out in the open. Somebody could have stopped this at any point. I'm worried that they see it as advantageous if this country is partitioned and divided into separate little regions, each of which will be, run by some sort of oligarch fiefdom and then stripped for parts. I think they see as a big problem that we're too big, that we are united in our American culture, which is why I think there's been an attack on American pop culture, on the music industry, the movie industry, media. You can complain about the quality of all of these things, but they did kind of bind us together as a nation, give us a sense of cohesion. So I'm worried about secessionist movements. They pay a lot of money to try to get people to try to secede. I'm worried they'll have us try to go to war with each other. I think that's why they play up this fake red versus blue dynamic, which was always, just horseshit. It was invented in 2000 during the Bush versus Gore election. It's not real. I say this from St. Louis, Missouri, which really, just destroys all of these stereotypes. Like I could drive an hour in any direction and see a million little different Americas, each with their own history, but still part of a whole. So that's one of my worries. The other one is a China style social credit system where
Mm.
surveillance technology and phones, especially, are linked
Black
to our
Mirror.
ability to get jobs, to pay for things, to use transportation. If we're caught saying something bad in their view, then we'll be prohibited from various actions. And it's already happening. It's happening to international students. And I think it'll eventually happen to more people. And because it's so hard to opt out of using a phone, and it's also hard to opt out of communication that's online, to just do print, we are able to be surveilled in a way that no dictatorship has had this power before. So they're combining 20th century fascism with 21st century surveillance tactics and, old school mafia state kleptocracy. And it's a bad, bad road ahead.
Well, you had problems, didn't you, with your book, Hiding in Plain Sight? Didn't, you're on lists, aren't you? I know
Oh,
Greg's got
sure.
Greg has his, official FBI file framed in his dining room. So,
I
I
have my
mean,
numbers, I have my
Great.
book
Now I'm
edition
hanging
numbers.
out with you so they
yeah,
could add
if
that
you're
to my
you're
file.
going to be on a list.
You don't know
Hanging
me.
out
You
with
don't know
Greg
me.
always
Never
gets
seen
a
you in my
You had
life.
no idea who I was.
You're not
yeah.
here. No,
Okay.
I mean I've had a lot of problems. Like there's so many things that I've written about that anger people that I never know what in particular people are mad at me for. Like, there's the Trump regime, there's the DOJ, there are a lot of plutocrats and oligarchs, there are foreign countries. Everyone has a reason to get mad at me. So, go read The Last American Road Trip, because all I am is a nice Midwestern mom taking her kids to national
My
parks,
God.
loving America, waving the flag, no trouble at all. How could you arrest a lady like me? But yeah, everyone's always mad at me, and I'm kind of used to it. But I am more afraid now, because they are cracking down harder on U.S. citizens, and they're going, of course, for the traditional targets first, tend to be Muslims, immigrants, green card holders, Black people, etc. I do think it is possible they will then move on to, the blonde red state mom like me. So nobody is safe. I've always known that. I was kind of hoping other people, like our officials whose job it is to protect other, citizens like me, would rise to the occasion and actually hold this crime syndicate accountable. And they instead decided to fund it and help it and enable it, therefore endangering my life and the lives of others. So I'm not very happy with them. And I guess we'll just see how this story ends. So I don't know what
Yeah.
to say. Sometimes there's
Let,
nothing
let
to
me
do but
bring
laugh.
let me bring you into the arguments that Pat and I were having before you came on, actually. I argue with my liberal friends um, that what they miss about Trump when they're obsessed over Trump is they miss the fact that it's a global phenomenon. You have Modi, you have AfD in Germany, you have Maloney who just visited Trump in Italy, and you go back to Berlusconi, a similar kind of character as Trump. You had Boris Johnson and the what is it, KIP group, the Brexit group in the UK, and on and on. And France Le Pen. And so it's an international phenomenon. It's not unique to us. We have our own specifically American windbag, blowhard, Bulgarian, but everyone has their own version and they're emerging and they're growing stronger. So it must be something that's in the wind that's profound and deep in the societies, Western European societies, but also in India and other places. So we're going to combat this and we're going to get beyond it. We have to identify what's causing it. And what do you see as internationally is making people like Trump appear to have an answer to people?
I think a lot of this is a reaction to climate change. And I think you can go back
Mm.
to the early 1980s and the Exxon documents where they knew exactly what the future is going to look like if they continued, fossil fuel production and consumption at this rate. that there eventually was going to be a struggle for resources, increases in temperatures, mass climate refugee crises. I think a lot of plutocrats have been aware of this for a long time, and they basically saw the last decade as a time to shore up their assets, hoard resources, pit the population against each other, get rid of things like public health, let people die in pandemics. I think they kind of want a depopulated Earth. They also want people, they've explicitly said this, to lose their empathy, to lose their compassion, to stop helping each other, stop seeing each other as a society. I feel like this has been going on my whole life. And you could look at even the Reagan administration, his Secretary of the Interior believed that it was the rapture, believed Armageddon was coming.
Wow.
So let's just cut down all the trees and let's just let everything die anyway, because it's the end of the world. So there's been this combination of climate change knowledge and apocalyptic messianic rhetoric from multiple administrations. It was in the Bush administration too. It kind of hovered over the Biden administration a little. All of that is very bad for people who don't want policy to be based around the rapture, and who would like to have plants and water and air. I think that kind of motivated it, and it certainly gave more of an incentive for people like, say, Jeff Bezos or others who once opposed Trump to now join him, because they don't want to be on the losing end of what they see as an existential bargain.
That's why I like you, Sarah. I mean, you say stuff, and I swear you're hanging out in a basement of a pizza place, and and yet
This looks like a pizza.
a couple years later, you, it turns out you're right. And in your book, you talk about the oh, what's the airport in Arkansas when you went
Mina,
through?
Mina Airport,
You talk
Mina
about
International.
Mina, and you talk about the CIA running in crack and this and that, and you, but you're not a nut.
No,
You have the information to back up that these patterns were known, were aware. Clinton was involved, other people were
he was
involved. It
at
was
least
all hushed
aware.
up.
I don't know if he was involved, but
Well,
yeah,
I mean, but they helped hush. They certainly put
yeah.
a
They certainly didn't
stifle it.
prosecute him. like,
Right, right. And and that's what I like about how you write. You say these things, but then you'll back it up with, okay, here's what I
yeah,
know.
well, that was like a streamlined controversy, because I remember being a little kid, and because I ruined a sleepover party by talking about it. And Iran-Contra was a really big deal. Like, the hearings were on TV every day, it was in the news all the time, and then it just gets forgotten. I feel like it should be taught in schools. That's one reason I brought my son and daughter to see the airport, so they could, learn about Iran-Contra. But I think a lot of these conflicts where there's no justice, there's no real resolution, they're not taught. They'll teach Watergate. They'll bring that up. They'll be like, oh, Nixon had to step down because, he had violated laws and norms, and we are a nation of laws, and justice will always prevail. They ignore all the ones where the bad guys get away with it. They get appointed to new administrations. You see the same names popping up again and again. And I think that was a big touchstone. So yeah, and it's really awful for the reporters of that era who, worked on those stories. Like Robert Perry was one. He also looked into the October surprise, all called conspiracy theorists, all called crazy, and then vindicated, sometimes after they died, which is really shameful, but vindicated years or decades later for stating the obvious. And I think a lot of people they see it too. They don't want to state the obvious because they think it'll hurt their career or their reputation, or, more credibly, I guess maybe they worry about their life and their security. But I think a lot of times it's not that deep. A lot of times it's really superficial. They just want to climb a little career ladder and get ahead instead of telling their fellow Americans the truth. And I think that's shameful, especially about historical events like Iran-Contra.
That's what supports the illusion of a democracy.
Mhm.
The fact that Robert Perry can expose something, but it's pushed aside. It's on the back pages if it appears anywhere, and a decade later it's confirmed, but it doesn't matter a decade later,
Yeah.
and it's forgotten. And
And
so
there's no
that
apologies to him. There's
right,
no kind of, hey, this guy
and if you
risked his whole
say
career on it.
if you confront someone in the government leadership with this is the real nature of our so-called democracy, they'll say, but look, it was exposed. We know it's true, but it's too late to matter. And that's the beauty of it. This is the kind of thing that when that the good writers write about in terms of how democracy doesn't function when it's pushed aside and revealed later. Like what's coming out now around the assassinations. I mean, to give Trump credit for that, he's putting out a lot of material around the Kennedy assassination and RFK's assassination. Where it goes, I don't know, but I mean, it's stuff that should have been released a long time ago. And
Yeah,
I think
all of this should have been. If Trump releases 9/11 stuff, that'll be real interesting. But honestly, I don't trust anything that Trump releases because I think it's going to be just as selective and sometimes doctored as any other administration. They do it piecemeal. I can't remember a time that this country wasn't waiting for JFK documents. He was
Mhm.
assassinated decades before I was born, and I remember the movie, the Oliver Stone movie kind of sparked some interest.
you
That's probably how I learned that there was a whole other story to it. And then little bits and pieces along the way, but they do that purposely to drag it out and make it so that people, can't tell what is true, what is partially true, what is lie. They want it to be as confusing as possible so everyone just loses interests and shrugs their shoulders and walks away.
I gotta ask you, you're a pretty tough person. Are you tough enough to watch Adolescence on Netflix with your 14-year-old son? Have you
I
watched that
keep
yet?
hearing about this show, but like, I mean, maybe this is just a result of being on tour. I don't even exactly know what it is. I guess it's
Uh,
about a boy who killed somebody or something like that. But it's a
right. It's a
fictional
it's a
show, right?
yeah, it's a 4-point show, probably some of the best TV, but it talks about the problem with young males, how I mean we're having a psychiatrist on in a couple of days that mentions that, young males for the first time ever are more conservative than their parents, not young
Hmm.
females. And that's not in America, that's all over the world. So there's something, and also there academia. I mean, when years ago you would always complain that young girls can't do math well, can't do engineering, can't do law. Well, they're exponentially more represented and doing better in those fields than young males. So it's this overview, and a lot of it is social media and
Hmm.
the problems associated with that. And talking about they knew, Meta knew that these algorithms were problematic and creating
Yes.
psychiatric issues with some of these people. So anyway,
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's a big issue because I think that there's a whole bunch of political operatives who see, teenage boys or young men as ripe for recruitment. And
right.
I do think, though, that there is an actual demonization of young men, and I'm
Hmm.
conscious of this as I'm
Right.
raising my son. And like one of the rules we have in our house is that whatever he finds on the internet, even if it's disturbing or offensive, he can show it to me and he can ask questions and he will never ever be in trouble for asking questions about things he's found because a lot of times he's just watching something on YouTube and then the algorithm does its thing and then some horrible thing comes his way and he's just wondering. And so just, we try to keep everything open and so that he doesn't feel some sort of sense of like shame and having stumbled upon something. And I think that's important for parents to do, for girls too, but particularly for boys, because they are much more likely to be targets. They're much more likely to be sort of forced in this sense of I'm being persecuted, I'm being isolated, and sometimes they are. I think they're being generalized about in a way that, like, as a mother of a teenage boy, I really don't appreciate. I think they're being talked about in a really derogatory fashion, as are teenage girls, but that's a story like as old as time. I think that this is a little newer, what's happening with teenage boys.
You
What
know,
did
it's not easy to be a young boy or a young
Mhm.
girl or
Yeah, it's a hard
anyone,
age.
black or white, or in America today. And I think that's kind of the way we have to approach it. We have to view it as we've got to make this a better country
Yeah.
so that as a nest for young people, it will keep everybody moving forward. It's not that way now. I mean, it's hard. It is hard for young boys. I mean, so many ways, but it's just as hard for young girls, and it's just as hard for black kids and Hispanics in America. And that's, I think, what we really have to try to fight for, to really
Right.
bring forward.
Yeah, I think there's an incentivized culture of cruelty that people need to move against. And I also think everybody, not just kids, but adults, they're afraid to admit when they feel vulnerable or hurt or any other way on the internet because they know people might take that pain and then weaponize it and use it right
Hmm.
back against them. And I think to be
Right.
a young person, the internet used to be a place where you could find fellow young people going through the same things you are, who maybe don't live near you. You know, it provided a sense of security and belonging, and it's not doing that anymore. It's a place where you can get attacked or stalked by total strangers, and that's hard for an adult to deal with, but it's incredibly hard for young people to be bullied in that fashion. And that's something,
Right.
that's another thing I'm always telling my kids, like, you got to tell me if people are doing that stuff to you, because I'm the queen of getting bullied on the internet, and I will tell you how to handle it. But I need to see what's going on, because I need to make sure that you're safe, both physically, but also just psychologically. It can really take a toll that I think a lot of folks, they don't want to admit to it, or they feel silly talking about it, but it does matter. And it's important that kids are not treated that way and don't think it's acceptable to be treated that way or act that way, for that matter.
Hey, what did your kids think of the road trips? You are the exact age as my oldest son. I've got two kids. God, there was nothing better than in the summer jumping in our Volkswagen van, no air conditioning, and just taking off and hitting it brought back so many memories, fond memories. Do you think that they liked it as much as you
Well,
did?
parts of it they liked as much as I did. I mean, they loved the national parks. They loved going
Mhm.
somewhere like the Rocky Mountains, Glacier, White Sands in New Mexico, all of these interesting landscapes. They loved Death Valley. They're absolutely obsessed with
Mhm.
Death Valley. When I would drag them to, like, hey, wow, kids, we're in Harry Truman's childhood home. They were like, oh my God, there were a lot of moments like that, or just like I'd see some weird store and I'd want to stop, or a landmark. I'm like, oh, this is where the Stringtown Bonnie and Clyde shootout was. And they're like, stop, stop. The kids are kids, and the older they get, they become teenagers. They have their headphones. They don't want to listen to what the dreaded mommy's iPod. I refuse to stream music because I think artists should be paid for their work. So they're stuck with me and what they think of as my atrocious music. So a lot of it is, I left that out. But generally speaking, yes, they love to travel. They're very curious kids. They very badly want to travel outside the country now that they've seen so much of this country. And I'm curious if we'll get to do that under this administration. But I'm glad I did what we did. But, no one likes going in a 12-hour car ride across Montana, except for possibly me. The kids reacted to that as kids do, which is, are you there? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? How much longer? So yeah, but generally, I mean, my best memories really are of these trips. That's why I
That's
wrote
true.
this book, is I wanted to emphasize what I love about this country, and not just things that are bad or painful.
Don't despair, Sarah, because and your kids, give them a sense that things can change. Because I remember my uncle who raised me. He worked in the mines for 27 years, and he got an industrial job for DuPont. And so he had, in the early 50s, we had a vacation. We actually had vacations, and we planned them. And we got our 55 Chevy and drove around. One of our first vacations was to the South. And imagine a young person going to the South for the first time with segregation.
Hmm.
A kid from the North who was kind of raised to tolerate people and be generous and kind. My family were all sort of left Democrats, and seeing segregation at that time, and it's still indelibly printed on my mind, going through the South and seeing blacks or Negro only and white only and that sort of stuff. And we got through that. I mean, it took a lot, and it was an ugly time, and people suffered. People were hurt deeply, killed, in fact, that fought through it. And so maybe that'll inspire your children to participate in what we're going to have to do to get beyond where we are now, because it is pretty bad now.
Oh yeah, I
Not
mean, they have
trying to
a very,
minimize.
very strong sense of right and wrong and justice, and some of that is from simply living in St. Louis, which witnesses so
Yeah.
many of these issues on a daily basis. But seeing things, I mean, one thing that made a big impact on my kids was going through Native American reservations, like
Mm.
both in Oklahoma
Mhm.
and in the Four Corners. In part because, like, just seeing all the different languages, seeing all the different tribes and groups of people, and then of course the landscape was so different, but also seeing incredible poverty in certain regions and knowing the history of how that poverty came about, of, what these groups had before the government took it from them or corporations took it from them. We had a very good time like visiting with people from the Navajo Nation, from the Cherokee Nation. And I'm just glad that they understand that, Indigenous people are here now, struggling now, fighting now, because it's often taught in schools, especially, if you grow up in the Northeast or places where there aren't as many, reservations or whatnot. It's like these are people of the past, of the American past, whose struggles are not relevant anymore. And I think the absolute opposite is true. I think there's so much to learn from that history. And my kids are very hyper aware of that. So, all of that has been a good learning experience for them. And they also just enjoy being there. They love Navajo tacos. They love arts and crafts and all the traditions. And, it's cool in that way. So I don't want to make it sound like we learned from, these people, because that always sounds very degrading. But they did learn a lot of history out there, which I think is good.
Well, yeah, the doctrine of discovery was officially condemned by the Catholic Church, what, Greg, 2 years ago?
Yeah, got around to it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Finally.
but we lost our Pope. We lost a decent Pope. I mean, that's
J.D. Vance, man,
yeah.
going in with the
They killed him.
I
You can't blame him. Yeah, somebody
Really
else told me
There,
that.
there
His
you
fault.
go. There you go. There's your next
And
book.
all that's conspiracy theory.
I'm
Now
not.
you're
I'm not ready. I will
He
not.
was just so disgusted with him as a human being that that was it.
I know. He stood up for Gaza, condemned J.D. Vance, and checked out of the world.
Yeah.
looking
He's
down on
done.
us and
He's
Drop,
laughing.
drop the mic, and then we're done.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. He
okay.
knew how to make an exit. That Pope. So
Hey,
yeah.
Sarah, I'm going to let you go because I know you're frazzled and busy, and I've been stalking you on the internet. I watched the one in San Francisco and the other one. It's fun to see how enthusiastic and supportive and happy the crowds are. These are
The
like, it's a
crowds are
fun,
great.
the crowds, they just, it's a fun time, and it's a
Yeah.
community, and I haven't seen one incident where people are being mean to you,
No,
or
they're so kind,
they're
so
just
so
really,
kind. Yeah, that's an
yeah,
absolute highlight. Like I going overtime. I know, but I just want to thank all those folks again, and thank you all as well, because it really means the world, especially when corporate media and so on are a bit
right.
wary of me. It means a lot to have that kind of support.
And I'm just a reminder, people subscribe to your Substack. Couple bucks helps,
Yeah, really
I give
does.
I give Heather Cox Richardson $5 also, and she made $5 million last year on her Substack. On her
Living
Substack.
well, spread that
living
largesse
large, Heather.
around.
Yeah, and then
Yeah.
she does that plaid shirt. I'm just a lobster farmer, and kind of
Yeah,
crap. Come
sure.
on.
Okay.
Yeah. She's got a $3,000 she's got a handbag worth $50,000. I know it for
Good
sure. So
Lord. Good
You're a
Lord.
sucker. You're a sucker, Pat.
I know. Okay. Sarah, thank you. Thank you.
All
Thanks,
Good
right,
luck.
thank
man.
you.
Enjoyed
Keep
it.
writing and keep going. And both you and Greg keep writing. I love your work. So
We
up to
will.
go.
Thank you.
Hope to see you
All right.
again.
Yeah. On the FBI list.
Yeah.
Yeah.